All right. Comment below if you can hear me all right. It's right around 5:50 right now, and we're going to wait until about 6 o'clock to be able to kick off the discussion. Is the audio quiet? Is the audio loud? I'm just posting the live video now on Facebook, group chat, Discord, all those places, so then everybody can see what's going on. Like I said, if you're viewing this, please help by just commenting, just saying whether you can hear me or not, whether it sounds okay, or if it's too loud, too quiet. Sure, start 10 minutes early. Okay, good. Yeah, we're not officially starting yet. I'm just getting it going so that other people can start joining in on the video beforehand, so then we all start at the same time. I'm waiting for 6 o'clock to be able to actually start the discussion. Cool, so I don't need that open anymore. I know, Jay. Sounds good, but and this may just be the video is choppy. Yeah, that Eli, that's probably just because I'm doing this through a somewhat older laptop. That's probably why it's choppy, like the mix between trying to be live using a somewhat older laptop, which has older software, older camera, all that type of stuff. So that's probably why it's choppy. Nothing to do about that. The newest laptop that I have doesn't have its own built-in web camera, so I had to pull out a different laptop that had that ability, and I'm using my newer laptop for all of the information. Five more minutes. Two minutes. Okay. Time to start. 6 o'clock. So, as the picture shows, we're going to be talking about this today, the actual world of Tanu. Now, this is actually the third map of Tanu that was developed over the course of some years. That was the one that ended up sticking. And all of this kind of began because of this Facebook game that group of friends. And it was a map game, kind of like Risk, where you start and you try taking over different areas from each other. There's resources, and you're playing with and against all of these other people who are representing other races, and everybody made up a bunch of races, and some of them exist to this day inside of the world of Tanu, and others don't. For instance, their Coraline was kind of an NPC country that was made as kind of a universal villain country for everybody to play against. And they were in the north of what was called Andoria, which is the birthplace of all living creatures in Tanu. Directly below Coraline, there was the kingdom of Sasha Heath, which is where we get the dragon people from. And each of these, like I said, were made up by different people, the different races. There was the Tal, which Tal was the name of the kingdom, and they were stone elves, and they were made up by another person. There was Feronias, which was made by me, and Dusk, which was made by my friend Mel. They were these technologically advanced fairies. There was Slow, which was a country of gargantuan-size sloths. They don't exist in Tanu anymore, but they existed in the beginning. There were the Zillican, which were the rodent people, specifically more like the mice people at the time. But the Zillican are still a thing in this world, but they went away, and then a new batch of them started up, and that's where we get the Zillican of today. There were the Dinarant. They existed in the beginning. The Dinarant were created by our friend Ethan, who wanted hobbits riding dinosaurs. There were the Longfang Mountains, which were the dwarves. I don't remember who decided that they just wanted to create dwarves, but I don't know. There were the Elential, which were, I don't remember who made them up, but they are once again another race that didn't make the cut. They were a race of elementals, like elemental humanoids that all lived together. There was High Mount, which I do believe was created by Becca. I think Becca was the one that made them up in the beginning, the giant rock people. There was Moor, which was the country of the Mormocks, and the Mormocks are still in existence today. Don't remember who created the Mormocks. Then there was Flount, which I always called Fluant, but then after a while, Kim told me, no, it's not pronounced Fluant, it's Flount. And so she's the one that made up the mermaids that we know in the world now, the Merwin and the Octowin. They were all because of Kim creating them as the nation of the Flount when we were doing the Andoria game. So inside this little history was like the first period of time in the world of Tanu. And during the course of that game, the Corlinian spread and ended up being a real problem for many other countries in the world. And the Furians or the Feronians actually abandoned Andoria and went south and just left the map, and they went to go form kingdoms elsewhere. And the stone elves that existed in Tanu, they died. They got completely wiped out by the Corlinians. They stayed in the north and they fought against them and eventually fell to the Corlinians. The Dusk, though, the technologically advanced fairies, they spread out across all the land that was tall and that was where Feronians were, and they just kind of took over all of that, wiped out, and eventually everybody left. Eventually, everybody left Andoria and went elsewhere, and then Coraline kind of took over all of Andoria. Once that game ended, because the game kept growing and growing, and we kept evolving it and making it better and developing the game, but it eventually got too complex for me to run as just a moderator each morning. Kim was going insane because it would take me like an hour and a half each morning just to set up the game for that day, so then everybody could play it over the course of the day through Facebook. Yeah, it drove me insane too, and just too much number crunching for me to do personally while trying to run that. So that game ended eventually. It just kind of halted out and stopped happening. And then we got the world of Tanu as we know it today, after one other map was created. So that's the story of Andoria, and that's why it was completely overcome by the undead. And that's kind of where the border of Coraline is now, is where Andoria is. If you go right below Coraline, if you look at this map of what was or what is Tanu, and you go here, that's Andoria, that little place, that city there. Well, city, it's like an area of land that is made up of all these like mini cities inside of it that have been overrun and destroyed. So it's just one big ruined area up here. This is the Northern Wastelanders Gauntlet, where great warriors come to prove themselves and defend the world from Coraline, to make sure that the Coralinians can't just flood down into the rest of the world. And this is the continent that the game of Wonderwood is happening in. Wonderwood is all the way down here in this little spot where these three roads meet. If you look right there, we've got Dino Washa here, which if you were at the quest last night, then you knew that Nick's character NPC that showed up in the village came from Dino Washa, came through the forest, and then met us in our own village of Wonderwood. Over here we have Furia, which is the kingdom of the Furians, and up here we have Highmount, which is where the Highmounts live. And they have this big rocky mountainous area surrounding them. And so when you look over at Mount Ascutney, like if you're in the village of Wonderwood and you look that way, like out towards the road, and you see the mountains of Mount Ascutney, those mountains represent that mountain range that separates us from Highmount and Furia. And then the forest that's behind the property, that represents the forest that eventually lead into Dino Washa. And so we're kind of just nestled in between the forests of Dino Washa and the mountains near Highmount. Now, the different races that exist inside of the game, people have asked me to give a little bit more detail as to the explanation of each of these different races, so then people have a better understanding of how to play their characters and stuff. I'll be writing all of this down, and it'll go in the rule book and all that type of stuff, but I figured I'd put up this little video. All right. So I'm just opening up the rule book. And if I go to the first category of just the races, first race, the Furians. The Furians were, or no, first race, Feronians. My making. I just decided that I would create a traditional medieval human race to exist inside of the world of Tanu when we were first playing that world game. And then eventually they abandoned Andoria first, before all other races did. They set up the Kingdom of Gartilia, which was once called Gantilia, but it was renamed Gartilia, and that was kind of retconned because the name of Gantilia existed in another piece of art, and I didn't feel like using the same name that somebody else already had. So it's called Gartilia, and Gartilia was like the kingdom of the Feronians. If you were from the most famous place of Feronians, you came from Gartilia. And we started doing role-playing games in the world of Tanu. We first started in Gartilia. Many games happened in Gartilia and then were abandoned, and then another game would happen in Gartilia and it would be abandoned, and it would just keep going like that. Gartilia was also where we first started playing with the Shadow Children. They first started becoming a nuisance and a problem for the people of Gartilia inside the role-playing campaigns that we were running. And Sarah Palong, who is the goddess that Sids, Daitola Holaki, Damiana, and some of the others worship. Sarah Palong was actually one of the players in the game, and it was a player character being played by Marnie. And Marnie's character, Sarah Palong, was just this young woman that got roped up in a cult of Ilana. And Ilana is the goddess of ecstasy and bliss and all forms of excess. And that campaign ended, and then other campaigns occurred, and it just kept going on and on like that, little campaigns. And then finally in one campaign, the group of players wanted to vanquish the Shadow Children from Gartilia once and for all. And so they eventually found their way into what's called the Crossroads, or Shauna, which is the realm of Slanfarnock, because that's where they found a portal to. So when they went into the Crossroads, they ended up finding this cabin out in the forest. And inside the cabin was this woman, Sarah Palong, who is now being treated as an NPC. And she had her cult of Ilana in there that she had become the leader of over the course of time while being an NPC out of game. And she was trying to raise this cult of Ilana to be able to create an avatar for Ilana, so then Ilana could come onto Earth again and to experience the world through people. And what the cult of Ilana didn't know, including Sarah Palong, is that they were actually acting as a host for both Ilana and Slanfarnock. Ilana knew it, though. She knew that this cult was actually kind of trapped into eventually being an avatar for both of the goddesses combined. Ilana was excited about the idea of mixing her ecstasy and bliss with the darkness and evil of Slanfarnock, because she hadn't ever really experienced those things. So she wanted to know what that was like. And when she mixed together with Slanfarnock and they created this avatar out of Sarah Palong specifically, Sarah Palong was born out of this kind of egg that they created inside the crossroads, and then the players had to kill Sarah Palong and defeat her in order to be able to stop Slanfarnic from spreading into our world. And they did. They succeeded. They killed Sarah Palong, and they destroyed the portal that led to the crossroads. And one of the party members, played by our friend Ethan, actually stayed behind in order to be able to destroy the portal from that side. That way it would stay closed permanently. And he's gone. We don't know where his character is now, but there was a statue built of him in Gartilia to honor his memory. And along again, but then a couple years later, and all of these games happened within a 3-year period, because the campaigns that I first started doing were set in the year 1000, and then by the time I closed the portal, it was the year 1003, and that's where we're setting the town of Wonderwood at, is that we are in the year 1003 and we are in the current time period of Tanu. I originally thought we would set ourselves in the past, but I decided no. We're set in the current time period of Tanu. And so Ronan wanted to create his character Sid's, and he was trying to come up with a goddess to worship, and we talked about it, and eventually we came up with Sarah Palong. And so we brought her back, and she was a fledgling goddess. She was a being that was trying to acquire the level of deity as the other gods have, at least the minor gods. She became a goddess of bliss and pain, those two things being combined together. And Sid's is her main reprobate, the main follower of her cult. And but back to Gartilia. So Gartilia is currently destroyed because when they defeated the undead, when they defeated the Shadow Children, another issue came about, which was undead and the Corlinians attacking again. And there was also a problem because Tekanor, the Tekites, were invading the city of Gartilia. Gartilia went into a civil war because of all of this stuff that was going on, and the entire city got destroyed because of it. And so the most famous and powerful Feronian city in this time was laid to waste because of the campaigns that these players were going through. It wasn't my fault as the GM; it was theirs. And so Gartilia was destroyed, and many of the nobles inside of Gartilia were killed because of the massacre, because of everything that happened. And so any nobles that could survive and lords that could survive abandoned Gartilia and just kind of went into exile elsewhere. So many high-ranking Feronians of that time are waiting and vying for a time to go back to Gartilia and to reclaim what was once theirs. Gartilia is kind of being rebuilt at this time because some Feronians have returned when they heard that the undead had been vanquished, and so they're coming back and starting to rebuild the kingdom together. Yeah, Jay, it's funny because like it was a campaign that Jay was in where they actually killed the queen of the undead, the queen who was the source that was controlling the undead at the time. And when they destroyed her, her power relinquished all the undead, and the undead collapsed and ceased to be. And then they won. And so now Gartilia is free, and people are going back and trying to rebuild and reclaim it. So that's Feronia in a really long, drawn out story. And the reason why it's so developed is because so many role-playing campaigns have taken place in Gartilia with the Feronians and all that type of stuff. So then we've got the Techites. The Techites are another race of humans that were created in the beginning 1,003 years ago. They are not Feronians. They are completely separate, completely separate race entirely. They never started as Feronians. Feronians never started as Techites. They both started separately from two different players inside the world game that created them. Oh, and yeah, Jay, his character, Arg, the undead guy, the Corlinian, yep, he's a sniper who is also a follower of Sarah Palong as well. Sarah Palong is definitely the cult of Sarah Palong. The Reprobates is the single organization that exists inside of Wonderwood so far. No others exist yet. Nobody's formed any. But there's talk of this rabbit duck, and there's this talk of possibly worshiping, what was another one? There's another god that people were talking about. There's other things that can be formed too, like the Healers Guild and a Warriors Guild or anything else. Like anything can be named and then created in as an organization, as long as it has tenants and a certain number of followers, like of that specific organization. So we're hoping that more people will start to create organizations, which then creates more dynamics and conflict inside of the game. So yeah, the Techites. The Techites are a completely separate race from the Feronians, and they are steampunk-based humans, and they use lots of guns. And as a nation, they're I would consider them to be an evil nation because they try to enslave other countries or civilizations that they come across that are weaker than them. And they're quite powerful as a nation. They cause a great amount of deforestation in the world. And they're actually ruled over by a queen who isn't really alive anymore. They've kind of, through advanced steampunk technology, have like preserved her body by slowly turning her into a full-fledged machine. And now the only thing left is kind of her consciousness inside of the machine. And he continues to rule over Tekanor, the country of Tekanor. And jewels inside of Tekanor aren't necessarily evil. It's just them as a country that do lots of terrible things and therefore kind of make the people do bad things. And they replace many of their body parts with steampunk technology. And so a lot of their body ends up being metal, and they are missing limbs because of it, and they replace them. The Illuvians. The Illuvians are a race of elves that came from space. Tanu, because of the destruction of the Tal, who were the stone elves back 1,003 years ago, because the stone elves died out, there are no elves in Tanu to begin with. They never started there. And then 1,000 years later, the Illuvians landed right above Gartilia. There were two ships. One of them was in pristine condition. The other one was completely wrecked. When people came out of the wrecked one, well, the okay looking one, they met Illuvians, and they were these very tall, 8-foot tall, elf-looking beings. Like, they had pointy ears, and it ranged between very short pointy ears to very long pointy ears, depending on their age. The older they were, the longer their ears were. And so they're these very tall, beautiful, elegant beings. And and they are very scientifically advanced. They had spaceships, they had laser guns, the type of armor that they had, everything about them was far more advanced than anything else that existed inside of Tanu. They were here because their planet blew up, because their star that their planet rotated around went supernova. And when their race knew that that was going to happen, they created these two giant vessels, and they were not meant to be ships that lasted out in space for very long. Their whole goal was just to jump to our planet, which was the closest habitable planet that they were aware of, and they would start living in Tanu. They didn't know if anything else was living on Tanu. They just knew it was habitable. And so they filled up these two large vessels with as many of their people as they could, that they put in through this raffle. And it was completely random in order to be fair. And so many families were split up because of it. And it was very sad. But all of these Illuvians packed into these ships and then took off for our world. And they got here within a few minutes because the Illuvians, all their technology is actually wrapped around this like pseudoscience. This is like this magic science based around the void. They use the chaos elements of the void in order to be able to do amazing things with their technology. And so they use this void energy to teleport themselves across the universe to where we are. And when they did that, one of their ships did get here in just a few minutes, the way it was completely planned to. And the other ship didn't. The other ship took about 500 years to get to Tanu. But it all happened in the 3 minutes that the other one proceeded as well. So everybody got here in 3 minutes, but one of the ships felt like they took 500 years. And the ship that felt like it was trapped there for 500 years were trapped inside of the void itself. And during that 500-year feeling time period, those Illuvians became what are called the Duskites. And they didn't have any food. They didn't have any real water to survive on. Their entire civilization broke down inside of the ship. And within a month, they were using each other as resources. It was a terrible, terrible time. And they lost track of their technology because their ship just became kind of their world. There was nowhere to go in the void. There was no land around them. There was nothing to go to. It was just nothingness around their ship. And so their ship became their planet. And after 500 years was up, they were all very pale because of 500 years of surviving metal contraption. And they lost track of their scientific technology, and they became like magical users that wielded the power of the void itself, and very strong warriors as well, because it definitely was strongest survived, like the survival of the fittest type thing. And many of the people who started on the ship to come to Tanu didn't make the trip. They didn't survive. And so many Duskites are new Duskites who are younger than 500 years old, who have been surviving on the ship since their birth. Some of them might have been born to be food. Some of them might have been born inside of like the higher decks of the ship, which was actually something that one of the players, Ren, came up with last night, is this idea that possibly the higher levels of the ship were for those who were the strong, who were kind of surviving and making the other levels of the ship do their bidding. And then Syndra, who's played by Shannon, she was potentially on a lower level of the ship and possibly was meant to be food at one point, but survived. So I like that. I like the concept of these people who, again, they're this almost hierarchy that is literally depicted through the levels of this ship. that some of the other players came up with. And so when the Duskites got here and the Alluvians got here, the Alluvians were really surprised about what happened, but they just decided to abandon the Duskites. They were just like, well, these aren't Alluvians anymore. And so the Alluvians set themselves up. So once again, we are here on this lower part of what's called Trollum, which is the name of this continent. This half of the world basically is Trollum. And so we're here, and the Alluvians put themselves on the northeasternmost part of the continent, and they just named it Alluvia after their own planet. And the Duskites, they crashed outside of Gartilia, which Gartilia, so once again, we're here. Gartilia is all the way over here, this island, next to this other continent. And so the Duskites landed in Gartilia, crash landed next to Gartilia, and then their void engine malfunctioned after they had landed here, and they were teleported and crashed into this, what's it called? Mount Slumber, which is in the Sands of Time, which is also part of Trollum, but it's in the Sands of Time here. And when they crashed there, the Duskites now live there as kind of their country, their home is that mountain. And the Duskites are very pale. They're very survival based, and they don't have all the technology that they once did. They're quite barbaric. The Alluvians, on the other hand, still very scientifically advanced, and they live in Alluvia. They're pretty secluded from the rest of the world, and they kind of keep it that way because they're afraid of what others inside of Tanu would do with their technology if they ever possessed it. And some Alluvians chose to abandon their technology and to start to live in this world like the rest of them. And that's where we get the name elf inside of the world of Tanu. An elf is just an Alluvian who has chosen to be more like those that live on this planet. And so they've abandoned their technology, and they pick up a bow or a sword, or they become magicians or scholars inside the Furians. The Furians were once Feronians. They were a colony of Feronians that left Gartilia long ago, and about 1,000 years ago. And they formed a colony in Trollum instead of being all the way on their island of Gartilia. Like we talked about, the colony of Furia is here, and we are here. And when they formed their colony, they lost connection with Gartilia. A war had broken out that Gartilia was now involved in, and they didn't have communication with Furia anymore, or with that colony, because it wasn't. During that time, the Gartilians that the Feronians that were living in Trollum colony felt abandoned by the Feronians of Gartilia, their kingdom that they came from. And because of that abandonment, they stopped trying to have connection with them. And during that same year, all of the horses that lived in that colony died off. And horse, they're like spiritually bonded with, and they had this great connection with them. And when that connection was severed, the colony of Feronians in Trollum were their hearts were decimated. I put it that way. Like they were in a very bad place when all of their horses died off. And this one woman inside of that colony took a hike one day up the mountains around what is now Furia, and she was planning on just letting nature take its course on her. She was just going to let herself die up on these mountains because of the loss of her horse. And when she climbed to the top of some of these mountains, she eventually came across this giant nest. and this humongous phoenix came flying in, and it landed in its nest, and it looked at this Pharaonian woman and saw that she was missing something. Like the phoenix could sense the heart of this Pharaonian and saw that she was like ready to die and needed to be reborn, needed a new life, and needed connection. And so the phoenix allowed its soul to bond with that Pharaonian woman. And when it did that, the fire burnt the old life away from the Pharaonian, and her hair caught on fire, her skin caught on fire. And when she came reborn as a Furian, her hair was literal flame and her eyes were red with fire. And she was the first of the Furians. And then all the colonists that lived in that specific colony converted over to be a Furian. They found a phoenix of their own to bond with, and they all joined into this one civilization that they then called Furia. And so they became fire mages and great warriors with their fire magic, and they rode phoenixes, and they built their cities with the idea of flight in mind, and these giant aviaries that they set up so then their phoenixes could live with them. One weird thing about them is that they can't raise phoenixes themselves in their own city. It doesn't work. So they have to go up to these mountains and take eggs from phoenixes that are wild and raising their own up in these mountain ranges. And they have to them back to their civilization to then hatch them when they're close to ready to hatch. They can't harvest them when they're not ready to hatch because the incubation just doesn't work for some reason. They need a wild, undomesticated phoenix to actually produce the young for some reason. And so those are the Furians. They're pretty hot-headed. They're angry still over their abandonment with Pharaonians, so they do have kind of like an issue with Pharaonians in general. Anyone who specifically came from Gartilia. If you're a Pharaonian that lives somewhere else, then that's fine. Okay, the Seelie Fae. The Seelie Fae is a really large collection of different types of fairies. So when you see the term Seelie Fae, it's not referring to like one country. It's referring to the entire race that is Seelie Fae, good fairies. And it's not even a race because really it'd be broken up into just like one category, Fae. It's just all fairies. And fairies are many different races of spirits and whatnot that live in the world. And they have their own plane of existence that they live in, but then they also live inside of Tanu and their own kingdoms. They abide by their own rules and their own laws when it comes to how things are run. What we might deem to be good and necessarily what a Fae considers to be good and bad. But the Seelie Fae, or at least the ones that we would look at and think might not want to just kill us. They might have good in. Whereas the Unseelie Fae, they want to cause us pain. They want us to suffer. They're known for their malicious intentions. And they live on the same continent that Tekanor is at. And Tekanor is the country of the Tekites. So this mountain range, half of this continent is Tekanor. And you notice there are no trees there. And then this half of the continent is all forest, and that's where all the Fae live. The Unseelie Fae live closer to the Tekites than the Seelie Fae do. The reason why is because the Unseelie Fae are more willing to go to war and fight against the Tekites than the Seelie Fae are. They're much more hateful, and so they're much more ready to fight the Tekites. and they preserve nature. That's one of their key things as Fae, is that they're trying to preserve the natural world. And the Techites are very much opposed to that. And so there's constant war between Fae and the Techites. But yeah, any type of fairy that you can look into through folklore and whatnot, pixies, brownies, anything like banshees, so many different types of spirits that you could then say, yeah, that's a type of fairy that can be included in the Seelie and Unseelie Fae. Only difference really is that like the Seelie Fae are more, they look more the way you would imagine the aspect of nature, the not necessarily good, but life. And then the Unseelie Fae are more death and decay and destruction, that aspect of nature. And so that's really how you can view them, as not necessarily good and evil, but life and death of nature. Then we've got the Merwin and the Octawin, which are the mermaids and the octopus people. They're pretty standard looking when you think of like a mermaid, or if you imagined like an Ursula type character for an Octawin. They were once the Flount, which was the country that Kim originally created once upon a time. They live all over the world in many different pockets, but specifically their biggest kingdom is, if you look at this map, this entire little continent with a big old sea filling up the most of it is where the country of Blashun is. And Blashun is that city as well. Like their country is inside this big sea. And that's where the Merwin, the Merwin live. And the continent is called Cathuso. And around this sea on the mainland is where the Nephilim tribes live. And the Nephilim are a race of sea serpent people, kind of like Naga. They're huge, and they love the Merwin and the Octawin. They view them as like this perfect thing, and they dedicate their entire lives to a single Merwin or Octawin that they come across, and they protect them, and they're very dedicated. That's what they view their entire life to be, is the protection of a single Merwin or Octawin that they care about. Even though most of the time the Merwin and the Octawin do not give that love back, the Nephilim doesn't care. The Nephilim just loves unconditionally that Merwin or that Octawin, and will live its entire life dedicated to the Merwin or the Octawin. The Merwin and the Octawin love pretty things. They love hoarding pretty things and finding pretty things and crafting pretty things. Then we've got the dwarves. They're pretty standard dwarves. When you think about a dwarf, they're rune smiths. They live underground in mountains and in caves, and they do smithing and blacksmithing and all that stuff. The one aspect about them that makes them different, specifically for the world of Tanu, is the fact that the dwarves, they live here, which, once again, we've got Trollum, and we are all the way down here. We go all the way to the north. This section of huge mountains are called the Caverns of Nested Wings, and that's where the dwarves live. And the one unique thing about them is it's called the Caverns of the Nested Wings because many dragons are born in the Caverns of Nested Wings. Most of the dragons of the world are born in the Caverns of Nested Wings. And the dwarves and the dragons have a very symbiotic relationship. Oh, yeah. Jay just commented that about a Merwin that we blinded once upon a time in a campaign that they were doing, and it was just they were looking to be able to make these Arugi, which are these little tiny creatures that humanoid races hunt for their blood, but the players wanted to save them and keep the Arugi safe, and so they were trying to create this like type of bubble that they could all have around their heads, or a way to make sure that they don't have to survive in water, so then they could always stay with the players, so then they could keep them. One of the ingredients that they needed to make the spell happen was the willing tears of a Merwin, and one of the players just summoned a Merwin to them. And conjuration in the world of Tanu isn't making something literally out of nothing. When you conjure something, you're actually pulling it from somewhere else. Somewhere else in the world, that thing is no longer there. And so when they conjured a Merwin was literally pulled to where they were, up onto the shore from somewhere out in the ocean. And they eventually convinced it to cry, and the Merwin was like, okay, I guess I'll do this for you. And so then one of the players started creating this magic to make the Merwin sad, so then that way it would cry for them, but it was willing. The magic that they tried casting accidentally turned necromantic as they were casting it, and ended up turning these green liquid shards that pierced into the face of the Merwin and blinded the Merwin, because the shards went into the eyes and stabbed into the face, and they went into excruciating pain, because once it, like, their face was pierced with all this necromantic, like, sharp goo, it then hardened into these crystals, and it broke off. And so this Merwin just had these crystals embedded in its face, and it was in a lot of pain. They still, like, held him down long enough to still harvest tears off of him as they came dripping out of the sides of his eye sockets. And then they healed him, but he was never able to see again. And then they okay, go away. And they dismissed their spell, and the Merwin went back to whatever kingdom it came from, blind. So yeah, random Merwin story. But back to the dwarves and the dragons. So the dwarves and the dragons have this symbiotic relationship where the dwarves live in these, like, lower kingdoms inside the mountain ranges of the caverns of nested wings, and the dragons live above them in, like, upper caverns. And in these upper caverns, the dragons, they lay their eggs, and unlike how you'd imagine something that lays eggs, these dragons that live in the caverns of nested wings never have to incubate their eggs, because they know that the dwarves below them run these gigantic furnaces inside of their kingdom, specifically to keep the kingdom above them of the dragons hot enough that all of their eggs are kept warm and nice and toasty, so then the dragons can be free to do whatever they want. And the dragons know that the dwarves are going to protect their eggs, so they also don't have to look after their eggs. So dragons in this world kind of get a really great deal of not having to take care of their young, look after their young, or anything. Because once they even, baby dragons already know to go and find a human to, like, bond with, and they just start living their life on their own. But they often will climb down through the caverns of nested wings to where the dwarves are, and a dragon will find a dwarf or on any humanoid that's living in their kingdom, and just kind of pick one out and say, okay, you're my humanoid now, you're my person. And the dwarf has no choice. That dragon is now bonded to them for the rest of their life. And the dwarves fashion beautiful clothing and armor for grown dragons, and they live together really well. It's the one aspect about them that makes them very different from other dwarves and other stories. So then we've got the Sasha Heaths, which are simply a dragon at some point had a baby with something that's not a dragon. with some humanoid race. Often they're dwarves or they're Pharaonians or some other one of the humanoid races that can get along with dragons really well. And the dragons have the ability to shapeshift and turn into humanoid form if they're old enough and powerful enough. And so Sasha Heaths were originally made because of the breeding of dragons with humanoid races and through magical means. And when Sasha Heaths were born, because of that breeding, they then started breeding with each other, and that created an entire race. And that's where we get the Sasha Heaths that we have now today. Once upon a time, when it was just Andoria, the Sasha Heaths were more like what we know dragons to be. They weren't so much a humanoid race. They were just dragons that were being treated as an entire race inside the game. And that's what we know as dragons today. And Sasha Heath is just a word that's used by their race to call themselves dragons, but they're not dragons. Sasha Heaths are proud. They like pretty things, kind of like the Merwin and the Octawin, but they're less interested in pretty stuff, more like pretty races and interesting things and anything that makes them curious. Sasha Heaths are very curious creatures. And they like collecting things that other people deem important. Corlinians, they are the undead. You can play one inside of the LARP, and the Corlinians are they're not necessarily evil, especially not now, because the main source of evil that was controlling all of the undead in the world was destroyed. And so the Corlinians are now their own sentient individual race. And they're just an undead version of something else that exists in the world. So if you pick to be a Corlinian, you get the skills of a Corlinian, but aesthetically, you look like something else that has died and has rotted a little bit. And you're either like a zombie version of it or a skeleton version of it or anything like that. Mostly it's skeleton and zombie, because when you start getting into vampires and other things like that, that's actually other creatures that exist inside of the game that you can hunt and whatnot. And so whatever race you are, that would kind of help you with your temperament and your attitude. The Corlinian aspect is just the fact that you're dead. Then we've got the Qualics, which are animal humanoids. And Corlinians, even though this is Coraline, which is where like the evil realm of Coraline is, where the Corlinians originally came from, Corlinians are kind of everywhere. Anytime something dies, it's possible that something will bring it back and make it undead in the world. And that's where we get the Corlinians elsewhere. There's also the Swamps of Souls. The Swamps of Souls is also another large area where the Corlinians live, but they're mostly all controlled by vampires and whatnot, different vampire counts that exist there, or countesses. So then we've got the Qualics, which their main homeland is this continent of Mayador, which is in this lower part of the world. Gartilia is over here. We as Wonderwood are over here. Mayador and the Qualics are all here. But there is also a colony of Techites that live on Mayador, and they're constantly at war with the more tribalistic Qualics. The Qualics, like I just said, are very tribalistic. Their societies are more primitive, and they like to keep it that way. They like to keep themselves very connected with nature, and they don't wish to create all the giant things that other humanoid races build in the world. Their Qualics are not like what are called Awoken. Everybody met an Awoken the other day in the last LARP that we did. An awoken is something that doesn't have human level sentience or humanoid level sentience in the world of Tanu, and magic then bestows sentience upon it. So like the tree that everybody met yesterday, that's an awoken because magic made it wake up. And then a qualic is different from an awoken because like a cat, for instance, a random everyday cat, if it became an awoken cat, it would still walk around on four legs. It wouldn't acquire the ability to have thumbs or do anything like that. Its structure wouldn't change, but its ability to speak and express human words and emotions and everything, that would all happen. So an awoken is that. A qualic is the specific race of animal humanoids. They have thumbs, they have the ability to walk around on two legs, but they look like the race that they were. And so if they're a rabbit, for instance, like Sid's, he's a rabbit qualic, not an awoken rabbit. And so qualics usually still kind of have some of the temperament of the type of animal that they're from, but they're not like bound by that. The Arachii are spider humanoids. They were created originally by the goddess Slanfarnik, who's the goddess of evil and darkness. And they are not necessarily evil, though. They're just hungry. Arachii are often hungry, and most of their life is circled around the idea of getting their next meal. And if you look at this map again, and so we've got Gartilia here. The Arachii live in this mountain range nearby on this continent, and that's where they live. And inside that mountain range, in the forest, they set up giant webbed kingdoms. Live in holes in the ground as well, where they have their nests underneath the ground too. And they're not necessarily very intelligent, but they're also not dumb. They're just hungry. They're pretty close to animalistic in nature, but they have the ability to express themselves and to be intelligent and all that type of stuff. They don't focus on those things. They're very, very much a warrior-based society. And we've got the Unicorns. The Unicorns are a race of unicorn humanoids, another race created by Kim. She always makes the pretty ones. Now, the Unicorns are interesting because they are unicorns that through magic learn to be able to shapeshift themselves into a humanoid shape. They are similar to that of a satyr. They are often also holding on to their unicorn horn that comes out of their head, and they usually have like horse ears coming out of the side of their head. And they're a very beautiful race, and they're better than everybody at everything. They create some of the best smith work in the world. They create some of the best art in the world. Their architecture is the best in the world. They come up with some of the most interesting and developed in the world. They know it. They're better than everybody, and they know it. But through that also makes them somewhat racist and elitist towards other races. They say, well, we're better than everybody at everything, and we know it, so why should we view everybody else as equal to us? They usually don't like talking in other languages. They usually prefer speaking in their own language of Unicorn. But if they feel that they need to, they'll speak to others in common. But they don't enjoy it. They do it because they feel they have to. Their society is pretty much broken up into mages and warriors. There's not a lot of rogues, like sneaky people in their society. They're pretty straightforward as a race, and they're even elitist against the other half of their society. So the mages and scholars look down on the warriors as idiots, and the warriors look down on the scholars and the mages as cowards. And so they're very picky as a race when it comes to who they will even deem themselves willing to speak to. Which is why, as one of their racial flaws, they cannot take extra language as a skill, because they just refuse to learn multiple languages. They don't need to. Everybody should just speak Unayakorn. But they are very brave, and they're great at everything. And goblins are all over the planet. They're a small group of what once were Mormocks, because I didn't create orcs or goblins in the world at first. But then goblins became a thing. They from Mormocks and became smaller and a little bit more intelligent than Mormocks. And they're not necessarily red-skinned anymore. Mormocks are red-skinned. Goblins aren't necessarily red-skinned. They can be green-skinned, blue-skinned, gray-skinned. Their coloration usually depends upon the type of environment that they live in. They quickly evolve and adapt to the type of environment that they exist in. So they're quite hardy little creatures that can get used to a type of environment very quickly. They'll even grow hair very quickly if living in like a wintry environment. They'll grow like fur almost to be able to keep themselves warm. But then if they move to a more tropical location, their fur might fall off and whatnot. Or if they live long enough in water, they'll become amphibious. Like their bodies evolve very quickly. Then we've got, and goblins are usually not trusted to be town guards because of their affiliation with Mormocks, and because they're sneaky and they're thought of as, like, people usually look at a goblin and they get a little bit sketched out by them because goblins are usually kind of sneaky or shady about what it is that they're up to. Riayans are another subgroup of Feronians. They were a colony of Feronians that also went over to Trallum, the continent of Trallum, and they ended up, like, once again, Wonderwood is here, Riayan here. It's very close. It's within 45. Less than like 250 miles away is how far Riayan is from Wonderwood, and that would be about 250. So it's roughly, if you walked from the south of New Hampshire or Vermont, and then you walk to the north of Vermont or New Hampshire, you might have like 50 more miles to go after that to get from Riayan to Wonderwood. So it's not very far away in order to like get to that location. So the Riayan. The Riayan are another colony of Feronians that, instead of feeling abandoned, they actually did the abandoning. They thought that they could do better as on their own rather than staying as a colony of Gartilia. And so they formed their own civilization, and their visual inspiration is based off of like feudal Japan. So the idea is that they're like a samurai type culture. Ethnically, no, because ethnically all humans are just mixed. There's no specific, everybody isn't white Like they're just a large melting pot of ethnicities in the world. The Ryans are just culturally based off of feudal Japan. And they are the richest nation in the world. And when I say that, I'm usually just meaning that in the sense of their nobility are the richest in the world. They have a lot of the wealth in the world. They've harbored a lot of it, and they're collecting it, and they're hoarding it. Their peasantry lives the poorest in all of the world as well. When it comes to developed, strong nations, their peasantry live very poor, terrible lives. And the Ryan nobility don't mind that. They're okay with that because they wish for more for themselves. So they're very greedy, or at least the nobility are. If you're not a noble Ryan, then you might not have the same mindset as the nobility do when it comes to getting wealth and taking advantage of others. And so the Ryan live here, or at least all the nobility and the really rich do. The poor peasantry live here in the villages of Tull, which is, you have to travel through this forest and all that. Like the Ryan peasantry live further away from Ryan than Ryan is from Wonderwood, from us. And the peasantry have to do all the work and everything that then the nobility take advantage of and collect a lot of wealth from. Then we've got the Dinarans, which Dinarans are hobbits that ride dinosaurs. That's really it. They're short. They have big hairy feet, and they ride dinosaurs. Dinosaurs exist inside of Tanu, and they exist in Dino Washa, which is right here. Wonderwood is here, Dino Washa is here, so this forest actually harbors a lot of dinosaurs in it. And the Dinarans ride those dinosaurs and raise them together, and they live together. But they're treated more as like pets and animal companions and things like that. They're not like dwarves and dragons where they have this very symbiotic friend relationship. Dinarans have a pet and animal companion relationship with dinosaurs. And the Dinarans are somewhat primitive as a culture as well. They prefer nice peace and quiet. They prefer things to be run a little bit slower and a little bit more relaxed. Then we've got the Chukaharas, which are a race of demon-like beings. Now, the Chukaharas, they live in a country called Aspazio. And so once again, we are here in Trollam, all the way up here in this forest. That's Aspazio, and that's where the Chukaharas live. They are a race of these demon-like beings, and they raise goats. That is their like animal of choice, is that they raise goats. And they use dark magic to keep goats alive when they kill them, like when they cut them up and be able to like eat them and stuff like that. And they make tools out of these goats, and they make their homes out of goats, and they make their walls around their tribe out of goats, but they keep the goats alive with this dark magic. And so all the parts that you see making up their weapons, making up their homes, making up everything are still alive and experiencing everything that they're going through. And they do this because they don't want the goats to rot away. The reason why is because they're trying to create enough living but dead, like kind of destroyed life on this planet, so then their god can come forth and destroy the planet. And their god is called Wrongfur. and it is called the Great Mess. And the Chukaharas believe that one day Wrongfur will coalesce out of all the goats and then roll across the world, destroying all life on it and consuming all life and ending all life on the planet. And the Chukaharas wait for that day. They believe in that day and they wish for it to come. That doesn't necessarily mean Chukaharas believe in this. This is just a faith that was formed because of the Chukaharas, but individuals might not necessarily worship Wrongfur and wish for this moment to come, but many of them do. And them as a society, they're fairly isolated inside their giant forest. And once again, they kind of keep it that way, and they don't really reach out too much into the rest of the world. And quite tribalistic, and they use dark. Okay with that because they want to see the world get destroyed, or at least all the life on the world to be destroyed. Aesthetically, they would look the way a tiefling would look if it looked a little bit more demon-like. If their body was a little bit more plated or scaled, if their tail was a little bit sharper, if their fingers were more like talons and their teeth were sharper, and just a more vicious looking tiefling. Then we've got the Croatoe. The Croatoe weren't originally a race that was going to be in the LARP because they're just a crow. They're just a crow. They're not like the other sentient races. The Croatoe are a group of specific crow awoken whose beaks are made out of the hardest material in the world. And they're amazing smiths, and they communicate through beak pecking, like the sounds that they like, almost like a Morse code. Like they tap on things, and that's how they speak with each other. So if somebody played a Croatoe in the game, they would have to make like a puppet that they would wear on their hand, and then they wouldn't exist anymore, and the puppet would be their character. It's a very cool concept. I hope somebody eventually does it. I think it would be a neat thing to see. But the Croatoe inside the LARP can speak to others, and they don't necessarily have a home. They don't really have a specific place on the map of where they live. They're kind of scattered around the world. But they're known for living where the Seelie and Unseelie Fae live. And the Croatoe are very, very picky about their friends. They mostly stick to themselves and the other Croatoe, and they will only befriend another creature if it has been saved by that creature. If it seems like it truly is out of the goodness of their heart, a Croatoe will then help those who are not Croatoe, and they will fashion amazing armor for them and create wondrous things for them that other races aren't capable of doing. So the Croatoe are amazing smiths, and they're interesting creatures, but nobody plays a Croatoe right now. Then we've got the High Mounts. The High Mounts are a race of rock giants. In the world of Tanu, they're huge, they're gargantuan, they're large beings. But in this game, they would just be rock people, just large rock people. So people could wear like large boots and then create a costume that makes them look like they're made of rock. And then they could just be these tall rock people. The High Mounts are like I discussed, we're here in Trollum, and the High Mounts are right there. So they're, besides the mountains, they're about away as if we were traveling to Rian. And the High Mounts are reclusive, and they don't desecrating their graveyards, which consists of pretty much everything inside of Highmount, inside the valley that they live in, because when a Highmount dies, they just leave their bodies where they fall, and so they're all over the place, and these places end up looking kind of like a somewhat less thought out Stonehenge. Like their entire civilization just looks like that because their bodies die and they fall, and then they're just rock piles. But they're considered sacred rock piles, like because it's their own bodies. And so over time, the high mounts are kind of running out of space that they then deem to be their holy places, like to deem more holy places out of. And it's very difficult for somebody to go to Highmount without accidentally desecrating a graveyard. But they're very kind to outsiders as long as you don't desecrate their graveyards. Yeah. Then we've got the satyrs, which are the only reason the race of satyrs exists in the LARP is because of Nick. Nick wanted specifically to make a satyr race, so a satyr race was made. But really, satyrs are like a small group of fae. Like satyrs are just considered a group within the unseelie or seelie fae. But he wanted specifically to call himself as a race satyr. So he did that, and they got the powers that they have, and now the satyrs exist as their own race. They live inside the same place that the seelie and the unseelie fae live. They're not necessarily considered one or the other. They can join either group. It just once again depends upon whether they idolize life or whether they idolize death in how they present themselves to the rest of the world. Then we've got the half Mormocks, which are a Mormock is a large to huge red-skinned orc-like creature that has bones out of its joints. They're usually bald. They're very vicious, very animalistic, not on the same level of sentience as other humanoid races are. But they're just huge and scary and very physically intimidating creatures. And they have some resistance to magic inside the world of Tanu. Inside the LARP, they have the skill Rage, so they're just very barbaric creatures. And but you're a half Mormock, which means that a Mormock had a baby with something else. And now we've got this half-breed between the two. And so they might have hair now, or they're not completely red, or they might not have the bone spurs sticking out, but one way or another, they're half bred with a Mormock. And so usually they have a little bit less potential of intelligence. Like they're usually a little bit less spry in the mind, but they're very strong warriors and very barbaric. So that's it. Those are all the races that exist in the world of Tanu. Do any of the four of you who are watching have any questions about any of the races, thoughts, or things that you would say, like, what about this? What about including that? What about talking about this or that? Like, or yeah, like I said, any questions about any of the races? And after I'm done with this video, I'll probably try getting like the group chat going for the LARP and start sharing pictures of crafting stuff that we start doing together tonight. So if anybody starts crafting anything, to be able to put up those pictures in the group chat. So I hope this video was useful, And even though it was live, people can now look back on this video to be able to get a great understanding, a very in-depth description of each of the races. It took me a while to go through all of this, but hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, I will be in the group chat starting to work on different crafts and whatnot. And if other people want to share things that they craft, then do that. All right. See you later. Thank you, Eli, and thank you, Jay, for taking part in the group chat or in the comments of this live video. It was very useful. It was very useful being able to have that, to be able to like inspire me to think about other things to potentially talk about while doing the video. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you guys through the group chat.